And with that, I will make my little pitch. My pleasure now to be joined by the Statewide Counties Association Executive Director, CSAC Director, Paul McIntosh. Paul's bio is in the pamphlet. He's a former county administrator, rose up through the ranks, and I've had the pleasure of working with him now for several years. And we're going to talk about the joint principles that have been adopted by each of our organizations. The CSBA, the League, and CSAC have all adopted these joint principles. And the discussion that we had at the July summit was about the joint principles. And we spent 3 hours. I'll stand back up. We divided into groups of 25, and we spent about 3 hours on Saturday morning discussing suggested principles, and arrived from that. The task force arrived at the 9 principles that we're going to review for you. And the purpose of these principles is that's how our leadership, CSBA, CSAC, and the League, that's how they're going to be evaluating those proposals that are going to be on the ballot. And that's why it matters to all of us. And accordingly, we might think about, as one of our next steps later in the day, I'll put this in the bucket right now, that perhaps that might be something that we individually, our various agencies, would like to do, is adopt resolutions or adopt these principles ourselves. But that's what we'll be talking about at lunch. So I need a clicker. I think we've pretty much gotten the point of this, that the state prioritizes its needs over ours. And I had a slide here about the turning point in our relationship, if you will, was Prop 1A. And I think that Chris covered that. Is there anything you'd like to add about Prop 1A, Paul?
The only thing I'd say, by the way, good morning. The only thing I would say about Prop 1A, as Chris said, it was a negotiated proposition with Governor Schwarzenegger. It has some changes from what we were working on originally through what we called at the time local, which is was a group formed of cities and counties and special districts to protect local revenues. I think it was Prop 65, if I remember right. I forget the number on it now, but it was much stronger than Proposition 1A, but Proposition 1A was a negotiated settlement with the governor, and the governor did support it and help us pass it, which was, I think, key to the ultimate success of that proposition. I would just say that it worked. Yeah, the state borrowed $2 billion from local government this year, but we were able to securitize against that due to the requirements contained in Prop 1A, a constitutional obligation of the state to repay those funds. I think Chris mentioned that if the state borrows money again, which they could do one more time within the next 10 years after they repaid the $2 billion that they borrowed this past year, that they may not pay the cost of that borrowing. They would still have to pay the interest, they would still have to pay repay the loan, but the cost of the borrowing is probably about $275 million that cost us this time to go around. But Proposition 1A did work, and we've made it work through our own diligence, not through the legislatures.
Thank you. I think we've this has pretty much been covered. These points about fiscal prudence isn't enough to protect our revenues, and the kinds of things that we need to do moving forward. These are the things that we already do at a county level. We do 5-year forecasting. We have a rainy day fund. We have a fiscal contingency plan. All these things that are listed. And Napa County, fortunately, not just this Board of Supervisors, but supervisors going back 10, 20 years, have put these, have helped get us to where we are. The performance-based budgeting part we've really done just in the last few years. And you heard that that's one of the things that the California Forward Group is thinking that should happen at the state level. The consequence of this, and you heard about California's bond rating, 50 or below out of 50 states. Napa County, we're number 5 or 6 out of 58 counties. But if we don't watch what happens at the state level, we're going to end up in the tank with them. So...
Let me just comment as well, that I think that's what one of the sources of frustration around the state. What Napa County has done to be fiscally prudent, to budget appropriately, to have the reserves that are necessary to safeguard the programs that they have. Other counties around the state have done that. They've made those tough choices on a year-to-year basis in adopting their budget, whether or not to reduce their employee population, whether or not to furlough employees, whether or not to cut programs. They've made those tough decisions and with you in the audience oftentimes. And so a great source of frustration, I think, to our county boards around the state is when the state doesn't do that, and then they come and take our revenues after we've been managing those revenues on a yearly basis in a very prudent manner.
So now we're going to go through these 9 principles, which are in your workbook, and we're going to dive into hopefully you'll dive into the details of how they might be implemented during our work group session. But I'm going to ask Paul to go through these principles and elaborate on them a little bit more. Thank you.
Well, let me just start off, first of all, by saying that when you have 3 groups like the California State Association of Counties and the California School Boards Association and then the League of California Cities, by its very nature, principles have to be general. The more specific you get in details, the less or the harder it becomes to achieve consensus on what those principles should be. We started this work leading up to the summit in July of last year, and as Diane has told you, a lot of that discussion was around these principles. We've been trying to continue to refine those subsequent to that. And each association, as an independent body, then needs to take those principles back to the association and work them for themselves. So these are kind of the base principles, and I would encourage you as well, as we're discussing these today, if there are additions that you want to make to the principles for Napa County, or if there are additions or changes that you want to make that fits your preferences, please do so. These are not hard and fast rules. These are simply guidelines of what we would then use as an association to, as Diane said earlier, to gauge the reform measures that are going to be put before the voters and before our citizens. The first one is responsive and accountable local governments. Local governments should have broad authority for bonds, taxes, and increases, allowing for greater transparency and accountability to voters. Local governments, cities and counties, are the portions, the levels of government closest to the people. We are also the most responsive to the people. As I said earlier, when boards of supervisors are in their boardrooms having to make cuts in budgets, it's with the people in front of them. The legislature doesn't hear from the people. They may hear from some lobbyists every once in a while, but for the most part, they're making decisions, and especially when they're on the floor, actually casting their vote, they're not hearing from the people. Boards of supervisors and city councils are those levels of government closest to the people, and they're the ones hearing from the people. So the first principle, responsive and accountable local governments. Do we get into the options that are on the slides? Oh, okay. All right. Well, yeah, let me first interject. We're going to, at lunch, we're all divided up into various groups. It's on your name tag. And we're going to sit and discuss these individual principles and some options underneath these individual principles in more detail. So, principle number 1, local government should have broad responsibility and authority. Principle number 2 is the state preemption of local control. And this is very, very similar to several states in their constitutions have a provision that, yeah, we have a state government, but really people work with a local government and that's where the services are delivered, that's where the responsiveness occurs. And so if there is a provision or a need for a statewide standard, that the state does have the ability to preempt that, but it's with a supermajority vote to do it. And so for the most part, when you have that strong accountability and strong home rule, the state can only interject a statewide control or a statewide policy or level of service by a majority vote when there's a compelling need to do so. Let me give you an example, maybe mental health treatment. That for the most part, counties provide mental health services within their communities and they're meeting the needs of the communities, but the state may determine that there is something that needs to be done for children that for a variety of reasons and compelling reasons on a statewide basis, they need to be done. And so the state then, if they found that determination by majority vote, could then establish that as a service level. But again, it'd have to have compelling reason. There'd have to be majority vote in the legislature to do that. Otherwise, the home rule would prevail. Enhanced protection from state mandates. Local government needs protection from state mandates that attempt to micromanage local affairs. It's a corollary to the principle number 2, that the state should not be micromanaging what's going on at the local level. If there is a compelling reason for a statewide concern, that needs to be done on a supermajority basis, but not on a detailed individual basis. And you hear a lot of talk about mandates, and for the most part, there's 2 different kinds of mandates from a county's perspective. There are what are called pre-Prop 90 mandates, which are mandates that go back to the early 1970s, 1972, I think is the watershed date. And prior to that, those mandates are not reimbursable to counties. And an example of that is that historically, I think it goes back into the 1930s, there's a section of the Welfare and Institutions Code of the California Statutes, Welfare and Institutions Code 17,000, that says that counties are the providers of last resort. So if a person doesn't qualify for any kind of state or federal aid, they come to the county and the county gives them general assistance funds. That's a local obligation. That's a local general fund obligation. It's a mandate from the state, but it's not one that's reimbursable because of that watershed. Mandates that have been passed post that era, though, are reimbursable. And there's a big, laborious, heavy process set up that cities and counties and schools have to go through a commission on state mandates to determine A, whether or not it's a mandate, B, how much the mandate is worth, and then C, hope that the state will appropriate funds. And for the last 5 or 6 years, the state has owed local government several $1 billion in mandate relief that they have deferred or not paid. So it's a big issue for cities and counties. Personnel policies and pensions. All local governments should have broad authority and flexibility in personnel matters. Again, it is up to local government to determine and establish the methods by which their employees are governed and by which their employees are hired, and the benefits that those employees should obtain. That's not really something that the state should be concerned about or should interfere with. It should be something that, again, the local level has the ability to do that. Principle 5 is to focus on outcomes in state funding of locally delivered services, very similar to what Fred was talking about in the initiative that California Forward has. We should look at the output and the accomplishments that local agencies should have extensive administrative flexibility or methods to achieve outcomes. Again, getting the state out of micromanaging our affairs. And this is probably, I think, much more an issue with schools and counties than it is with cities. But the counties administer many social service programs on behalf of the state and federal government. We're the troops in the trenches, if you will, while they're setting policy and giving us statewide letters on how to do things at the local level. We're the ones that actually have to do it and have to administer those programs. And schools are the same way. They're trying to teach kids in the classroom, and the state is telling them, well, you have to teach them this and this and this and this part of science, so you can't teach this part of science. Again, we think that local agencies should have extensive administrative flexibility over methods to achieve outcomes. And it gets back to the concept of very, very strong home rule, that local agencies know better what their community needs. Principle number 6 is to modernize state budgeting, right along with the lines of California Forward's first proposition. State budget process should reflect the best practices in state financial management. Everything I think that Fred went through, county leaders would say is budget 101. We've been doing that for decades. That's why counties and cities are managed in a fiscally prudent manner. It's because we practice those things. The state should be practicing the same thing. Number 7 is update state and local revenue systems. I don't think there's any question that the revenue system at the state and local level today does not reflect 21st century, especially at the state level. The property tax at the local level, since Proposition 13, we would argue needs to be revisited. Not that Prop 13 needs to be thrown out, but we think that after 30 years, you ought to be looking at your systems and making adjustments to those systems as opposed to locking something in concrete forever. At the state level, the sales tax, we are no longer a commodity-based or a consumption-based economy. We're a service economy. Broadening the base of that tax would reflect the economy today and be able to generate revenues needed in today's economy without relying upon an archaic approach. Number 8 is governance and responsiveness. State government should periodically review and improve when necessary its internal structure and operations. Again, I think you can see that we would probably be strongly in support of California Forward's initiative, because that's exactly what they're trying to do, is to have the state go back and look at themselves on a periodic basis, do fiscal reviews, do performance reviews, sunset programs that are no longer effective, modify programs that need to be modified. In essence, get away from the incremental budgeting process where you're just simply adding 5 or 6 or 7% on an annual basis to a program that's not working and not functioning and not providing the service that people need. And then finally, organization of the state legislature. It needs to be modernized to achieve greater effectiveness and responsiveness. Term limits has been the bane of effective government in California. I think Fred aptly described it. I think other speakers earlier have aptly described it. One of the better metaphors I've heard is it's like having a baseball team, and you can play your A team in the first inning, your B team in the second inning, your C team in the third inning. We're in the 7th inning, folks, and we're scraping the bottom of the barrel. With all due respect to the individuals serving in our legislature, and I think they're trying and doing as best job as they can, they just don't have the experience. There is a great deal of knowledge and experience that goes with being in those positions for a long time. And I'll relate back to you in 1992. I was a county administrator, and we were going through a similar hard time in budgets. And I think the state was facing somewhere around a $7 or $8 billion budget at the time. Those were the good old days. And counties proposed realigning several state programs in social service area. In other words, giving counties more responsibility, but also giving us the revenues to provide for those programs. Now, we were meeting with senior legislators, Bronson, Maddie, members who had been in the legislature for years and years and years, had been chairs of those committees, knew those programs, and could discuss with us and discuss how to make the changes, and knew how to make those changes to make those programs work. And I think by and large that realignment approach was extremely successful. It's probably about $4 or $5 billion worth of programs today. Yeah, there were problems, there were bumps in the road, but those programs are much better off today than they would have been had we not done realignment in '92. If we tried to approach something like that today, there's not a single member of the legislature that has a clue as to how those programs operate on an incremental basis. They're just not there long enough to learn and understand. And frankly, the staff, and Fred can tell you, the staff themselves are turning over as well. They don't have that knowledge and experience either. There are very few members of the legislative staff anymore that have been there longer than 5 or 6 years. Very few. And the brain drain out of that institution is truly appalling. And we've got to restore that institution. So that's the organization of the state legislature.